Thank you, Mark. You know, when I give these speeches, I always say it's a pleasure to be back if I was actually invited back. It doesn't always happen. So it's just a pleasure to be invited back. I think to myself, well, I guess I was okay back in 2003 for the other times I've spoken up here in Chicago. But it really is a pleasure to be invited back to this group. I mean, you all know the history much better than I do. This is the mother church. This is the granddaddy of them all. This is the group that begat all of those other round tables around the country so many years ago. So for all of us in the field, it's a great honor to come to Chicago and talk to this group. I think it's probably true outside of the region, the Appalachian region, certainly outside of places like West Virginia. Most people do know me for the Perryville book. But before I wrote the Perryville book, before they even sort of dropped in my lap, I was studying the Civil War in the Appalachian region. Because I'm from the region. I mean, you can listen to me a few minutes and you'll know I'm not from around here. The accent never quite went away, although it was always worse when I would call my grandfather on Saturday afternoons, and then it would really come back. And I was definitely from that part of the world. My dissertation that I wrote for Bob Johannssen downstate was about Southwest Virginia and the war. That became the first book. I've published articles on this topic from time to time throughout my career. I don't always get a chance to talk about it, so it's fun for me tonight to do something a little different and talk about the war in Appalachia. To begin with, having said all of those nice things about being invited back and complimenting you as much as I could, I do need to tell you something out the outset. It's Appalachia. It's not Appalachia. If you say Appalachia in the region, people will immediately know that you're not from around there. They might actually assume that you're somebody really dangerous, like an anthropologist or a missionary. We used to get those in my hometown, anthropologists and missionaries. So I'm going to use the pronunciation Appalachia because, well, it's right. Let's all say it together. Appalachia. Thank you. Thank you. You can now survive a trip through the Shenandoah Valley in a few months, or a couple of years. Civil War in Appalachia is one of those topics that sort of gets on the radar for a while, and then it disappears again. It's never really penetrated into the consciousness of most people who are interested in the Civil War, which I think is too bad. As I was saying in Milwaukee last night, I think that to study the war in Appalachia provides a very interesting perspective. It makes me think about what I thought I knew about the mainstream, the conventional Civil War. And hopefully by the time I'm done tonight, you'll at least be thinking in a couple of ways. You know, I never really thought about that before. Or maybe my assumption about this requires a bit more questioning. Now, of course, sometimes it does penetrate national consciousness. At our times, a little before, I think, I came up here and spoke in 2003 for Janet, the novel Cold Mountain came out. And of course, that became the movie Cold Mountain, filmed on location in Romania. Because let's be honest, that was the only place the filmmakers could find thin reenactors. That's a true story. Cold Mountain gripped this country for about a year. Everybody was reading it. It was a hot new novel. Historian Dan Sutherland and I showed up for a presentation in Nashville, Tennessee, and we were shocked because there were just hundreds of people there to hear us. They had come directly from Charles Frazier's talk, and I guess they wanted another hour of Appalachian Civil War history. So people know Cold Mountain, but then that moment sort of passed. Just a few months ago, on the so-called History Channel, I take that as an affront, actually. I wish they would just go ahead and rename it. I don't know. We kicked around some names last night, Bigfoot John. We had the Kevin Costner production, Hatfields and McCoys. Unlike Cold Mountain, which I actually think is pretty good. I think if you want to understand the Civil War in the Appalachian region, Cold Mountain is actually not a bad way to start. The Hatfields and McCoys TV special really replicated a lot of mythology. I'm going to talk about Anse Hatfield a little bit at the end of the talk. I say that, but you know, it could have been worse. We all know it could have been worse. Anse Hatfield could have been an ancient alien. History Channel joke, or Bigfoot. But then, I don't know if that's had any great impact. So, Civil War in Appalachia, what was it like? Why should we know about it? Probably a good place to start is with definitions. And I want to try to define Appalachia for you in a couple of different ways. First of all, I'm going to suggest something that will probably sound odd to you, but I think it's really important for us to keep in mind. I talk about the Civil War in Appalachia all the time. A couple of you now own a copy of the Civil War in Appalachia. It's an anachronism, though. It's really probably not what we should be saying, because in the 1860s, there was no concept of a place called Appalachia. No one living in the 1860s, with rare exceptions, thought of this region, as one place, with a common culture, or politics, or history, or what have you. We're so used to that it's hard for us to remember that for the Civil War generation, this was a foreign concept. This is like talking about United States history in the year 1000 when the Vikings arrived. They're showing up at a place that's going to become the United States someday. It certainly wasn't in the year 1000. Appalachia as a place, a single monolithic place, did not exist in the 1860s. Were there mountains still there? Oh yes, they're very old. Were people living there? Have they adapted to life in the mountains? Certainly. But they didn't see themselves that way. If you were living in this area right here, you were a Western Virginian. If you were living down here, you were in East Tennessee. But you didn't think that there was a whole lot of solidarity with people elsewhere in the mountains. You felt a lot more closer to people in your own state, or the South as a whole. Appalachia is an anachronism when we talk about it in the Civil War. It's a 20th century concept, created by people right at the beginning of the 20th century for certain reasons that I'll refer to here at the end. If you keep that in mind, I think a lot of what I say tonight will make more sense. And I think a lot of what you read about the war in Appalachia will make more sense. If you remember that we're taking a current idea and reading it backwards into a past where it really didn't exist. Now, if Appalachia is more an idea than anything else, it stands to reason that giving you a map is a little dishonest. You have to have a map. We have to know the region we're talking about. When I teach my Appalachian history course, it's the first thing I do. I give them a map of the United States and I tell them, show me where Appalachia is. You signed up for this course, show me where it is. The maps always look different. That's okay. Scholars' maps of the region always look different too. Depending on how you're defining the region, the maps can be very different. This is the map that I prefer. It's an older map. It was created in the 1920s by a sociologist named John C. Campbell. He and his wife, Olive Dane Campbell, were in the mountains for various reasons. They had been sent there by philanthropy. They were compiling information. Olive Dane Campbell was collecting old English ballads that had survived in the mountains. And for his book, John C. Campbell drew a map. And he said, this is Appalachia. In the 1960s, your federal government created the Appalachian Regional Commission, initially under John Kennedy, in an effort to get that legislation through Congress. They needed votes. The federal government definition of Appalachia is much bigger than this. It actually includes a good chunk of Mississippi. Because there were 2 Mississippi senators who were holding up the legislation. And it extends all the way into New York, well, for the same reasons. So that's the federal definition. Other historians, other scholars define it differently. Some people don't include northern Alabama, some people do. Some people include, well, pretty much everybody includes the Shenandoah Valley, but there are occasionally people who do not. So I'm talking about this core region, but understand, if you want to make an argument that Appalachia extends into this part of Pennsylvania, you can do it because some people have done that. If you want to make the argument that the largest city in the region is Columbus, Ohio, you can do it because there are people who point out that there are a lot of people in Columbus who come from this part of the world. So the definition is iffy, the map is iffy. We're going to proceed as best we can, keeping both of these things in mind. So, before I go to the next slide, I do want you to do one thing for me and sort of remember what this region on the map looks like. Sort of got that in your mind? Let's go to the next one. I don't know if I'm going to be remembered for much as a historian. Perryville book probably, maybe a couple of other things. But in the Appalachian region, one thing I am associated with is this notion of the myth of Unionist Appalachia. I used that in an article a long time ago, and it caught on. And it refers to something that I think most Americans, not just most Civil War enthusiasts, assume. And we've all run across it in even the most standard histories of the war or standard textbooks. And it's this notion that the Appalachian region was somehow united by anti-slavery and by unionism. Indeed, many people will tell you that this was an all-white region. If you look at the best books about the war, I'm thinking about McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, which I guess is still the sort of standard one-volume history of the war. That's what you're going to find. Here's the problem with that. If that was true, remember the map I just showed you, if that was true, there should be a real big black blob right here. All of this should be against secession. All of this should be colored in. But you'll notice that it's not. What you should notice, or I think you do notice, is that the Appalachian region, as we've defined it, is also pretty divided. Sure, you've got a lot of black up here in the northern part of what's going to become West Virginia. But it's not exclusive. And you'll notice that the entire southern half of the current state supported secession. By the way, they were opposed to joining the new state of West Virginia. Those counties are part of West Virginia today because that's where the federal army was when the state was created. East Tennessee, a lot of it, sure, but not all of it. And indeed, if we could dig closer, if we had a more detailed map, you could see a line of support for secession that runs right through the major cities and towns of East Tennessee, down the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. It's pro-secession country. I grew up about right there. It's very gray. And indeed, when I first went in to Bob Johansson's office so many years ago and started talking about the dissertation I wanted to write, I remember almost exactly what I said to him. I keep reading that Appalachia is full of Unionists, but I know all the guys out of my home county were in the Confederate Army. That's Montgomery County, Virginia. That's the home of the 4th Virginia Infantry. That's Stonewall Brigade. Most of the Stonewall Brigade was from the mountains. That's where the rebel yell comes from. It's the way that mountain people used to call in their cattle. I've heard my grandfather do it. Appalachia was divided. This notion that Appalachia was completely anti-slavery, completely unionist, is mythological. In fact, it's PR. It was created after the war. I mentioned slavery. Were there fewer slaves in the mountains than elsewhere in the South? Of course, with some counties to the exception. But look at it a different way. In 1860, if you look at the 1850 census, the 1860 census, of those areas that were to become the Confederacy, where had slavery grown the most numerically in that decade? East Texas and the Appalachian region of Virginia. Slavery was expanding, it was growing, it was becoming more important to more and more people. So this notion of Unionist Appalachia, they're all anti-slavery up there, they're all for the Union, it's not true. We've always known it's not true, and yet somehow that was the idea that penetrated the American consciousness. So the next question should be this: if Appalachia is so divided, why? What's the reason? For those of you who teach, or for those of you who use PowerPoint in other occupations, I'm about to show you the ugliest, worst put together slide in the history of PowerPoint. Think about that. Because there have been some really bad PowerPoint slides over the years. PowerPoint slides are not supposed to be wordy. They're not supposed to be text heavy. And I strive when I'm teaching to, come up with simple PowerPoints like this. But the one I'm going to show you is so wordy for a point. There's a reason for it. I want to suggest to you that the reason why people in this region chose to fight for one side or the other, or sometimes both, is awfully darn complicated, depending on what part of the region you're looking at, and depending on whose research you're looking at. So, I apologize in advance for the ugliest slide in the history of PowerPoint. There it is. Note the point at the top. There is no clear Appalachian pattern. No one has discovered a reason that works for that entire region. Most of us would argue because there was no region. But if there was an Appalachia, there should be some commonality. There doesn't seem to be. When you start looking around the region, different things become important. I'll just run through these for you pretty briefly. State politics and rivalries. Very, very important. People in the Appalachian counties of almost all of those states felt more or less like second-class citizens. They had often been underrepresented. In some states, like Virginia, they had partially rectified that. In 1860, the governor of Georgia, Joe Brown, we all heard Joe Brown, right? Joe Brown's from North Georgia. He's a North Georgia mountaineer. Very popular up in North Georgia because one of our guys is finally in the governor's mansion in Milledgeville. East Tennessee and Middle Tennessee. You're all going to Middle Tennessee next year. East Tennessee and Middle Tennessee have been at odds with each other for control of the state since before there was a state. When Tennessee was just a big county in North Carolina, groups in Knoxville and Nashville were vying for control of it. And very likely if one side, one region, one of the so-called three states of Tennessee was leaning one way, you could bet that the representatives from the other side were going to be leaning a different way. Middle Tennessee was incredibly pro-Confederate in 1861. East Tennessee was not. The idea that East Tennessee and Middle Tennessee could agree on anything would be surprising to Tennesseans even today. These state rivalries, these internal issues, are really important. Slavery. That's the one you'll often find in the textbooks. Non-slave owners supported the Union, slave owners supported the Confederacy. And that's true in East Tennessee. It doesn't seem to be as true in western North Carolina, where many of the leading local Unionists were also slave owners. It breaks down completely in other parts of the Appalachian region. And bear in mind, we're talking about counties where slaves might have been 10 or 20% of the population in some cases. It doesn't work just to explain it that way. Geographic origins. The historian Ralph Mann at the University of Colorado has studied the counties in what we call far southwest Virginia, the little pointy part of Virginia down near Tennessee, and was trying to figure out why some families supported the Union and why some supported the Confederacy. And he tried all the traditional things like slavery, economics. Didn't work. But he finally found a pattern. People whose families had been in Virginia for 2 or 3 generations tended to be pro-Confederate. Those who had moved into the region from North Carolina tended to be pro-Union. Not just from North Carolina, but from what we call the Quaker Belt, around Greensboro. Quakers, pietists, there seems to be some religion involved here, at least traditionally. But you could break it down by the geographic origins of families. Maybe they were carrying those local and state rivalries with them. Geographic location and market ended up being the centerpiece of my dissertation and my first book. Show me a railroad and I'll show you secessionists in Appalachia. Show me a growing urban area and I'll show you secessionists. Show me an area where slavery was growing and I'll show you secession. Show me an area that has suddenly started producing crops for a wider market rather than locally and I will show you secessionists. That's true in Southwest Virginia, that's true in East Tennessee, according to other historians, it's true in North Georgia. People who were embracing new economic opportunities and economic ties to the rest of the South felt more tied to the South. Persistence. The longer a family had been in one place, the more likely they were to support secession. They're older, they're more established, they're probably more important, they're more tied up in the status quo. Within families, and this is actually true across the Confederacy, not just in Appalachia. When families divided, we all know about divided families, we talk about brother against brother, but it's almost always father against son in reality. And almost always it's the younger man, it's the son who's for secession, and it's the father who's against. There are exceptions, but there really aren't that many. Class plays a role, but it plays a role in different ways in different places. In East Tennessee, poor people tend to be Unionists. In West Virginia, poor people tend to be secessionists. Religion actually counts. Most of you know this, but for those of you who don't, the South seceded from American Christianity long before it seceded from the Union. The 2 biggest churches in the country in the 1840s were the Baptist Church and Methodist Church, and they split up in 1844 and 1845. Southern members seceded, created their own regional church bodies long before Fort Sumter. Methodists eventually got back together. The Baptists have yet to do so. That's the origin of the Southern Baptist Convention, the beginning of 1845. Methodists are more likely to be pro-Union, especially so-called Northern Methodists. Baptists were secessionists. Baptists, I grew up Baptist. My father was a Baptist preacher. I assure you, Baptists will secede from anything. My church is broken up, my old church is broken up more times than the former Yugoslavia. You haven't lived until you've seen your preacher and your head deacon having a fist fight in the main street of your town. That's what we do, we're Baptists. I'm an Episcopalian now, we got no problems. We just listen to the bishops. Finally, the one that I put in capital letters, because I think it's really important. Kin, neighborhood, local leadership. I'm going to talk about the Guerrilla War in a few minutes. And I want to tell you about a project that I did a few years ago. I was in the National Archives, and I was working on something else, by the way. And I ran across this wonderful source that I don't think anyone's used since 1865. They were still tied up in those cute little red ribbons that the War Department used. These were rosters of men who had been arrested in West Virginia and sent to Camp Chase in Columbus, Ohio. They were arrested for all sorts of things. And, a lot of times it was just the names, and I couldn't do much with those. But in a lot of those rosters, they listed what the crime was. And the crimes were really interesting. Cheered for Jeff Davis. You could go to prison for that. There were men listed as political prisoners. Just what it said, political prisoner. A lot of them were listed as bushwhackers, pro-Confederate guerrillas. And I put all those names together. I went through those rosters for part of the war. And I realized that for the first time, we had a roster of men who had been guerrillas. We had a roster of insurgents. For various reasons, I can talk about it if you'd like me to. I think that these documents are pretty accurate. I think we can trust the Union officer who wrote down bushwhacker, suspected bushwhacker. They were all supposed to be young and poor. That's what we thought about guerrillas. They're young, they're poor, they're shiftless, they probably don't have a settled home. We've been writing that for 100 years. I mean, the Union Army wrote that. I just took all these names and looked in the census and discovered everything we thought we knew was wrong. They ran across the economic spectrum from rich to poor. They ran across the age spectrum from the late teens into the 60s. But a lot of them were easy to find because they were on the same page as the census. They lived in the same neighborhoods. They lived next door to each other in some cases. And the same last names kept popping up. It was clear that for men who not only embraced secession in West Virginia, but for those who were willing to grab a weapon and go fight for it, they were often related. They were from the same little town. There was one local guy who had always been important. He's kind of the mountain equivalent of a ward boss. And I'm not stretching the point too much. Somebody you went to for favors. Somebody who could call in favors. It's an ugly slide. It's a complicated slide. But there's a point to the complication. The complication is there's no easy answer when you try to understand why the Appalachian region was so divided. And indeed, if it was one unified place, it ought to be easy, but it's not. So, secession, people choosing sides, sometimes they'll change sides. The war begins. And control of the Appalachian region was really important. It was important to both sides. More important, I think, than we realize. For one thing, with the second wave of secession in April and May of 1861, the Appalachian region found itself squarely on the border between the two countries, or the real country and the supposed country, depending on your politics. But there it is. And everybody in that region knew that when troops started moving, they were going to be coming through there. There was a later West Virginia politician in Congress in 1861 who referred to the region as the Flanders of America. We're getting ready to mark the centennial of World War I. But it wasn't just World War I that ended up being fought in Flanders. Every major war in Western Europe ended up in Flanders. It was nice and flat and open. It was a great battlefield country. These guys knew it in 1861. We are the Flanders of America. Maybe people down in Florida can ride out the war without having to deal with troops. Maybe people in Texas can ride out the war without having to worry about an opposing army coming through. We know we can't. We know what's coming. And we only pray it's not as bad as the indications suggest. In addition to just local geopolitics, in addition to location, Appalachia was important for its resources. Not so much for coal. You might think coal should be up there, but coal mining really doesn't take off in this part of the world until after the war. There's a little bit, but there's not very much. When we're talking about the resources of the Appalachian region in 1861, we're talking about salt. Salt's very important if you're a farmer in 1861. You can't preserve meat or indeed your vegetable crops without salt. You're going to starve about February if you didn't have salt the previous fall. Everybody needed salt. Lead, for obvious reasons, a lot's going to be thrown around in the war. Railroads, which ended up somehow being the topic of my first book. I was interested in Southwest Virginia and the Civil War, and ended up writing about railroads. And I think you can see why. Not the best map, but Richmond's right there. Montgomery, Chattanooga. When Virginia joined the Confederacy, the great connector between Richmond and the rest of the Confederacy ran right through the Appalachian region. From Richmond to Lynchburg, Virginia, the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad, from Lynchburg down to Bristol, East Tennessee, and Virginia, through East Tennessee, Chattanooga, and then the Western and Atlantic down to Atlanta. Bristol, Atlanta are creations of this railroad network. And this railroad network was incredibly vital to both sides. For the Confederacy, it not only meant the transportation of supplies and men, but it meant keeping the Confederacy linked together. Many of you would disagree with me, some historians would disagree with me, but I would argue that this connection was more important than the connection across the Mississippi that was lost at Vicksburg. Washington knew that too. Lincoln talked often at the beginning of the war about cutting the railroad. He referred to the Virginia and Tennessee at one point as the gut of the Confederacy. And so it should not surprise us that one of the main hallmarks of the conventional war at Appalachia was trying to cut that railroad connection. And in various ways, in various places, the Union Army tries to do it several times. Some examples of the conventional war, the war we all know, the war you might go visit at some point, in the Appalachian region. This is that moment when we sort of forget that Appalachia exists, and we talk about some of the major battles, and we don't think about the topography or the location of those campaigns. Spring 1861, George McClellan sent an army from Ohio across into what we would call West Virginia in an effort to protect the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and then hopefully to push south and cut the Virginia and Tennessee, to cut this connection. This is where you get those early land battles in West Virginia, some of which were on the quiz. Philippi, it's Philippi, by the way. Philippi, my aunt used to live there. Philippi, Rich Mountain, Cheat Mountain campaign with Lee, all of those involved attempts of the Union Army to push south and not just cut the railroad, according to McClellan. McClellan wanted to hold the region. He wanted to cut it and then keep it. That proved impossible. The topography of the mountains, there weren't enough troops. I told a couple of you earlier, I'm writing a book now about the effect of weather on the Civil War. The weather was terrible in that part of West Virginia in 1861. I won't bore you with a whole lot, but West Virginia's climate is actually part of the northern climate. It's not like any other climate in the south. It's part of the so-called cold zone. And it's a rainy zone in the summer. And so the attempt to push down to the railroad came close, but it failed. But it was successful enough that McClellan looked really good after Bull Run and left William Rosecrans and went east to command the Army of the Potomac. Something else from your trivia quiz. I'm starting to think that my PowerPoints were leaked earlier. It fit so well. September of 1861, Confederate Army entered into Kentucky, actually western Kentucky, As Leonidas Polk, he's usually proclaimed as a complete idiot for doing that. Had he waited 48 hours, U.S. Grant would have been the one to violate Kentucky sovereignty, and the whole course of the war in the West might have changed. But they don't just end up fighting out here. There's Confederate occupation across Kentucky, and there's a great deal of fighting in this part of the world along the Kentucky-Virginia border, especially for control of Cumberland Gap, which was still important. But this is also a way to try to get to the railroad from this direction. Just as future presidents like Rutherford B. Hayes are going to spend most of the war up here in West Virginia, this is where James A. Garfield first makes his reputation. Small battles that we've forgotten, but certainly people voting for Garfield later for the presidency knew about. Shenandoah Campaign of 1862. Hearing folks last night who said, well, I don't think of the Shenandoah as part of Appalachia. You'll find it on pretty much every map, with a couple of exceptions, of Appalachia. Because if you got to include the Blue Ridge, you can't have the Blue Ridge and not the Shenandoah. It's a mountain campaign, especially early in Jackson's campaign, when he actually fights John C. Fremont, where? Way up in the mountains, before he heads north back into the valley. And many of the Confederates fighting there were from those mountain counties. So I mean, it's very much an Appalachian campaign. After Shiloh, the Union Army moves into northern Alabama. In the first of several attempts to reach what? Chattanooga, to reach the railroad, to reach that railroad spine, to reach that gut of the Confederates. Fall of 1863, Chickamauga, Chattanooga battles, Burnside and Longstreet and Knoxville. That's all in the Appalachian region. And if that sounds odd, all you have to do is read some letters, or diaries, or memoirs from men who were there, and they will talk about the terrain. They will talk about the mountains. They will talk about the local people. They will talk about the weather. They will remind you that these were mountain campaigns. Sherman marching to Atlanta, right through the mountains of northwestern Georgia. 64 campaign. Largely fought in what we would define as the Appalachian region. When you look at it this way, I'll put it this way. When I look at it this way, the Appalachian War suddenly seems a lot more familiar and important than maybe it did before. But I want to add a caveat. I want the asterisk here. If you were living in the region during the war, that's probably not how you would define the war. We are so used to thinking about the Civil War in terms of the big battles and the big campaigns, we kind of forget what it was like to live out that war, especially in the South. One of my grad students a few years ago wrote a very good dissertation on a little county up here in North Georgia, Bartow County, Georgia. Sherman went through Bartow County twice. He went through Bartow going south, and then after Hood took off, he went through it a second time. Burned the county seat, Cassville. Burned it to the ground. For a couple of weeks, the Union Army was in force in Bartow County, and people noticed it made a real difference. But for the rest of the war, they generally were not. And so most of the dissertation was about something else. What was the war like in Appalachia most of the time? It didn't involve the big battles, the big campaigns, the major figures. A lot of the menfolk were off with those famous soldiers, but something else was happening in Appalachia. Daniel Sutherland, who teaches at the University of Arkansas, argues that guerrilla war was the war in Appalachia. He says that it went through 3 distinct stages. Men starting out, just like men everywhere else in the United States in 1861, choosing sides, Sutherland would say, on the basis of ideology. But as the war progressed, it was a war that became more personal, more local, and ultimately sort of nihilistic. People were killing because they'd been doing it for 2 or 3 years and they got really good at it. And that's what they did. In every part of the Appalachian region, two groups emerged pretty quickly, within weeks really, certainly within months. Bushwhackers were guerrillas. They were insurgents, if we want to use the 2014 word that our newscasters use speaking to other parts of the world. They were occupied by an army they did not want. They could be pro-Union, they could be pro-Confederate. They were the minority, they were the losers, they were the ones who had lost control of a certain area. And so they took to the woods and began a guerrilla war. They became snipers, they destroyed rail lines, they destroyed supplies. It got nasty really quickly. Home guards were their equivalent. They were also local men who supported the occupying army, who supported whoever was in power at that moment. And so they took up their weapons as well. Sometimes they joined formal units, and their job was to fight the guerrillas and to protect their homes and communities. And so you have groups of local men motivated by national ideology and all sorts of other reasons who started killing each other and attacking each other and raiding each other's communities and torturing each other's wives for information and all sorts of ugliness that begins quite early in the war. But you can't just think of the war in Appalachia as between these two groups, because there's always a third group involved, and that's the occupying army, the actual army. The Union Army in West Virginia, the Confederate Army in East Tennessee in 1861, who gets dragged into this local, nasty, small-scale insurgency pretty darn quickly. Surprisingly quickly. George Crook's on a quiz. This is freaking me out. Who's reading my mind? Classic example of what happens to the Union Army in Appalachia is with that man. That's George Crook. The 36th Ohio was out of Marietta, very southern Ohio, almost in my definition of Appalachia. They marched into West Virginia with George B. McClellan. They had a terrible time reaching their first duty station at Summersville, Virginia. They were hit with snipers. They were attacked repeatedly. They went looking for the men who were shooting at them. They couldn't find them. They found all the local folks unpleasant. They lost men. They found bodies that had been mutilated. In one case, beheaded. By the time they got to their permanent duty post in the middle of modern West Virginia, they were angry, they were frightened, and they wanted to strike back. And about that time, their new colonel arrived. George Crook had been a regular West Point graduate, and he had spent the 1850s fighting Indians in Oregon. Of course, we know Crook. He goes on to become, I think, an underrated general in the Civil War. If you're studying the Shenandoah campaign of '64, you're going to be looking at George Crook. After the war, he goes out west. He becomes even more known as an Indian fighter. He's the guy who brings in Geronimo. He's the Union general that Native American leaders most like to deal with because they see him as the fairest. George Crook came to West Virginia in the middle of 1861, took over this regiment that was in pretty bad shape, and decided that he was going to use the tactics he had used against the Rogue River Indians, against people who were supporting secession in the middle of West Virginia. The same tactics that the United States Army had always used against Indians. You destroy their towns, you burn their crops, you chase them around in winter time, you force them to break. Crook was very open about this in his autobiography. He used to send his men, well, he began sending his men out on scouting. Scouting is not benign. You should not think of scouting as something you did when you were 11. The modern equivalent phrase would be search and destroy. companies of 36 Ohio went out looking for bushwhackers. They got information about the location of those bushwhackers any way they could. They hunted men down. They initially arrested them. They sent a lot of them to prison in places like Camp Chase. But eventually, they just started killing them in the field. And Crook is very open about, and even proud, about how his men stopped taking prisoners. By October 1861, the Union Army is not taking prisoners in West Virginia. Not regularly. Sporadically, they're just killing people in the field. In January of 1862, Crook led his men on an expedition. They were again shot at by snipers, and so on the way back to their barracks, marching through about 2.5 counties, they burned everything on the road. They burned every house, they burned every farm, they burned every public building, they burned 2 small towns. Those of us who still want to pretend that the Civil War was a gentleman's war until Sherman and Sheridan came along in 1864 have not studied the Civil War in Appalachia. Mark Grimsley writes about the transition from soft war to hard war. In Appalachia, from the get-go, there was almost no soft war. And by the way, I'm not picking on the Union Army. Confederate troops are doing the same thing in the field of Zollicoffer, and later Edmund Kirby Smith in East Tennessee. So you've got bushwhackers, you've got home guards, you've got regular troops who are increasingly fighting like the guerrillas themselves. In April of 1862, the Confederacy started drafting troops because volunteering had dried up, and lots of men who had tried to stay out of the war immediately started avoiding the draft, going into the mountains, which were a great place to hide, laying out, as it was said, until moss grew on their backs. Hence moss backs. The Confederate Army especially will send militia, home guards, and later regular troops into these regions, find these draft evaders, and force them into the army. So there's another army marching around for a different purpose. Draft evaders often resisted. And this became ugly as well. The Shelton Morrow Massacre in North Carolina, January 1863, grew out of this. There were some mossbacks and draft evaders hiding in the mountains. A body of regular Confederate troops tracked them down, made them kneel, and killed them execution style. Henry Heath, who became famous at Gettysburg, had ordered this expedition. But the men who were involved in it, both the men who were killed and the men who did the killing, were from the same county in North Carolina. In some cases, they knew each other and saw each other as traitors. Could it get worse for the people of Appalachia? As Union soldiers deserted and tried to get home, as Confederate soldiers in Virginia deserted and tried to get home, they usually headed toward the mountains. It was easier to escape detection there. A lot of them couldn't get home, and so they just rode out the war almost as outlaws. Bands of deserters preying on locals trying to survive. Some mostly Union, some mostly Confederate. Sometimes deserters in some cases would just get together, and they would form these groups. And they survived by stealing from people. So if you're living in Appalachia, if you've sent your son off to war, you sent your husband off to war, this is what you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. That guy who rides up to your house wearing that nice blue uniform, well, he might be a Union officer, or he might be a Confederate trying to trick you into divulging information. He's just trying to find out which side you're on. And so you learn to be really careful about that sort of thing. There was a lady in Milwaukee last night who talked about one of her relatives and how her relatives were from Madison County, North Carolina, the location of the Shelton Morrow Massacre. She said nobody ever talks about it. That's not surprising at all. I'll tell you the same story I told her. My grandmother was born in 1914. She was born in eastern Kentucky. She spent most of her young life in West Virginia. And it occurred to me when I was a graduate student at the University of Illinois, writing a dissertation about the Civil War. I had no idea what side my grandmother's family had been on. I didn't know. Where I live now in Alabama, it's the first thing people will tell you when they see you on the street. Hi, my name's Bob, and my Civil War ancestor was in the 33rd Alabama. I'm not exaggerating too much. If this were a round table in the South, all of you by now would have told me about your Confederate ancestry. I promise you. People in the mountains didn't do that in the 20th century. Sitting with my grandmother at the kitchen table, and I said, you know, I have no idea what side your family was on. And this is what my 70-some-year-old grandmother did. In her own house, with no one in the house except the two of us, she did this. Making sure there was no one in the house. And then she leaned toward me and she whispered, "We were rebels." She had learned at a very young age that telling people that the Lawsons were rebels might not always be smart. This was the war in Appalachia. Last couple of points I want to make is how the war affected the region later on. We argue a lot about when Appalachian poverty started. We all associate poverty with the region today, and I think for good reasons. A lot of those reasons are much more modern. A lot of them have to do with the fact that the Appalachian region was blessed with a great natural resource that's always been controlled by somebody who didn't live there. And that's why all the profits went to Philadelphia or New York or later Tokyo. But we do know that the war caused enough dislocation and destruction in the Appalachian region that it took a long time to recover. There was lots of movement of people, both white and black. Whites fleeing one army or the other. Free people. Remember, there's a fairly sizable slave population in Appalachia. Free people facing violence during and after the war, many of them left. Again, the region did not become all white, but it was more white by 1880 because a lot of black folks had just left. Because they thought they'd be better off somewhere else, even in the Deep South. Perception. One of the things I do when I teach my Appalachian class, I just get in front of the whiteboard and I say, okay, tell me what you know about Appalachia. And I put things up on the board. And sometimes they're good things. Whitewater rafting, Appalachian Trail. The poverty always pops up. Somebody always wants to make a joke about inbreeding. I failed them. It's good just to go ahead and get it out of the way. But what else comes up? Feuding. That's not Kevin Costner, that's the real Devil Anse Hatfield. Who was Anderson Hatfield? He was a Confederate soldier who deserted in 1863 and came home because he was worried about Unionists coming across the Tug River from Kentucky and doing harm to his family. In legend and on the History Channel, the feud begins in the Civil War. And we forget that probably half of the McCoys also fought for the Confederacy. And most of us don't know that this most famous of the mountain feuds was pretty much the only feud in the mountains. There were a lot of feuds after the Civil War and Reconstruction, and almost all of them took place outside of the mountains, in Bluegrass, Kentucky, Middle Tennessee. But for newspaper editors and politicians who were trying to attract investment money into those regions, explaining the feuds away was easier if you somehow linked them to those crazy people up in the mountains. And so we think about feuding associated with Appalachia, when in fact we ought to think about feuding associated with the Bluegrass of Kentucky. Devil Anse, by the way, is what we might call an upwardly mobile entrepreneur. And the feud probably grew out of economic reasons and political reasons. He's posing for you. If you think you see a really violent, sort of ignorant mountaineer, remind yourself that his cousin became the governor of West Virginia. Rutherford B. Hayes, served in West Virginia, and was appalled by the people in general. If you've ever read Hay's diaries, I recommend them. He does not like where he's stationed, sort of like most soldiers don't like where they're stationed. When he became president, his wife, Lucy, was famous for not serving alcohol in the White House. They were very devotedly anti-alcohol, and so Hayes decided it was not just his mission as president, but his Christian calling to stamp out the abuse of alcohol in America, but especially in the Appalachian region. And so he empowered a new outfit called the Internal Revenue Service to send men into the mountains to stamp out the illegal production of liquor, which is something people in the mountains have been doing since before the Whiskey Rebellion. Hence revenuers and moonshining, which had always been legal. And finally, this whole notion of Appalachia is where I started, so let me finish. I spent a year working at Berea College in Berea, Kentucky. Berea is a fascinating place. It was founded in Kentucky in the 1850s by abolitionists. It was an abolition community in a slave state. As you can imagine, not real popular with the neighbors. They all got chased out after John Brown's raid. But they came back. They rebuilt their community. They built a college, which still exists. And they had all sorts of trouble fundraising in the 1880s, 1890s. And so they developed a very effective fundraising field. You should give money to us rather than all of these other southern places asking you for money, because everybody around here supported the Union. All of these brave mountain folks supported the Union. They still do that to a certain extent. When the year I worked at Berea, the Today Show came to Berea. We did a whole day from Berea. Somebody in our administration, I never found out who, actually took a film crew out to an old abandoned tobacco barn on the edge of town and told NBC that that was a house where one of the students had grown up. And the money poured in. Students almost rioted, but the money. When I was in Berea in 1988, it had the third largest endowment in the United States. Harvard, Yale, Berea. More than Chicago, more than the other Ivies. This is how that appeal began. By the turn of the century, Berea was in trouble. Berea was an interracial institution. It had black and white students, which was incredibly rare in that time. But the state of Kentucky was moving toward Jim Crow legislation and was going to stamp that out. And so the question was, how do we save Berea? Its new president, William Goodell Frost, was a son of abolitionists. His grandfather was the famous abolitionist William Goodell, graduate of Oberlin, that anti-slavery institution, and later Yale. And so Frost announced that Berea needed to survive because it was a monument to those noble whites of the southern mountain region who had so nobly defended the Union in the 1860s. He wrote a famous article called Our Contemporary Ancestors. They're stuck in the past, but they're still okay. And he drew a map of the region he was talking about. And he called it Appalachia. Appalachia was a fundraising scheme. It was like your favorite commercial. But it caught on and continues to catch on. What should you remember about the Civil War in Appalachia the next time you read about your favorite topic of the Civil War? Or the next time you go on tours, what should you think about? You should think, first of all, I will never say Appalachia again. You should remind yourself that the region was not united by unionism, but was incredibly and often violently divided. You should tell yourself that we still don't understand completely why people in the mountains chose sides, probably any more than we understand why people in other regions chose or choose sides. You should remember that the conventional war involved Appalachia more than we usually stop and think. You should remember that the war in Appalachia itself, for people who lived there, was in many ways an unbelievable, everyday horror that looks more like what we see on the news every night than what we think of when we consider the Civil War. And we should remind ourselves that a lot of problems in the region, including its poverty, in some ways go back to this war that occurred 150 years ago. And we're still dealing with the legacy of the Civil War in the Appalachian region. If you have questions, I would be happy to try to answer them, but otherwise, that's all I have for you tonight. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, in terms of modern Appalachia, does some of the things that we associate with Appalachia, poverty and so on, does that go up to the northern part of the mountains, to New York and Pennsylvania, New England?
New York, I don't know much about. These are fairly poor areas of Pennsylvania, absolutely. And, you know, it's a cycle that continues as coal is playing out. We see all sorts of new issues come along. I always remind my students that when OxyContin was first developed, it was dumped into the Appalachian region, and doctors were encouraged to write prescriptions for a variety of reasons. We were their guinea pigs. We were their test case. A poor region, a region that tends to get treated badly, that continues in all sorts of ways.
Economic links of Appalachia.
Thank you.
How many of them were northern economic links versus southern economic links?
Let me go back. The great link up here was Baltimore and Ohio. So all the economic links in northern West Virginia, let's call it that, were into the north. Everything else was shifting at this time, shifting south. And let me say why I use the word shifting. If you go back to the 1830s or 1840s, a lot of produce from this area is going north. There are actually cattle drives. We think about cattle drives in the west, but there are cattle drives and all sorts of agricultural products being largely wagoned out of East Tennessee, western North Carolina, southwest Virginia, up to Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia. In the 1850s, with the railroad, that trade more or less ends and everything starts going south. So in the decade before the war, you've got this shifting economics, and I think a lot of people in this region started to think of themselves as Southern. That's where their profits were. That's where their business increasingly was. So it's changes. When I did the dissertation, I watched it happen county by county as the railroad pushed through. How trade changed, how old trade avenues became obsolete, and people started using the railroad, and how everything started flowing in this direction.
Was there any ethnic dichotomy? In other words, that certain, the Irish favored secession versus Scotch-Irish versus German, etc.?
It's a question that came up last night, obviously. You know, there used to be this other mythology that the region was settled by the English, and that's why you have all these English folk songs and the like. You know, I still remember reading, well, you know, they still speak Shakespearean English in Appalachia. The largest settlement group out there was Scotch-Irish. The Germans were the second large settlement group. And if you look earlier in the 19th century, if you look in the 1820s or 30s certainly, those ethnic divisions are pretty fierce. The Scotch-Irish and Germans did not like each other. By 1860, there are still some German-speaking Lutheran churches in the Shenandoah Valley. There are still a few people who are hanging on to the German language. But by and large, with those last two generations before the Civil War, those ethnic divisions had largely disappeared through a shared sense of Americanism, and especially intermarriage. So the ethnic divisions among whites are not nearly as important as they would have been, say, in the Revolution. You got the obvious ethnic division based on race, but in terms of European origin, it's much less important by this period. Hasn't gone away completely, but it's much less important. German farmers and Scotch-Irish farmers from the get-go farmed differently. Everything from the shape of their barns to crops they grew to their practice of renewing the land. Some of that survives in Shenandoah, where you still find a lot of those German farming techniques that you can find, most obviously in Gettysburg. But that was just almost habit, what I learned from my father by that point. It was much less attached to ethnicity, with rare exceptions. I feel sorry for you people I can't see behind the column. How y'all doing? I used to get those seats at Comiskey Park. Because I was a grad student, I couldn't afford anything else. Any fans? Okay. You've been a great audience, as always.
One last item, for Ken, we make a donation on your behalf to a charity of your choice. We are involved in the preservation movement, and so we will do that for you upon your advising us what your. I don't want to assume that it's Perryville, of course.
You guys sing.
Okay, well, very good. We have good contacts with the fine people down in that region of Kentucky, and donation will be made. I don't know